Our next panel conversation could end up focusing almost exclusively on Iraq, but it does not really need to. We're going to be discussing democracy and development in the Arab world. And one more time I'll share an anecdote from a recent trip I made to Iraq. I was traveling through the south between Baghdad and Basra, talking as much as I could with ordinary people through a translator about efforts being made by the Americans to sow the seeds of democracy. And I was tracking some American officials and some academics who are over there with the mission of setting up democratic institutions, town councils, women's groups, unions, and trying to recruit Iraqis to these programs and also educate them at the same time. They were given 90 days, $167 million in 90 days to complete this process. And the anecdote that I would share would be a soccer game that I visited, and it was pointed out to me by one of the American officials whom I was focusing on. And she said, take a look at this soccer field. These are people who are, as she put it, thirsting for democracy. We've provided them with the uniforms and with the balls. Her point being any kind of organization, apart from any, as in the soccer team, any kind of organization, independent of the Ba'athist, not being centralized, but actually coming from the ground roots, was a step forward and a lesson for the Iraqi people in organizing themselves. And I went out and gathered around a group of these young men who were between the ages of about 14 and 19, I would say, and I asked them in an entirely unscientific way, but a way that we often use in television, just to gather around and have a conversation about democracy. And I asked them, can I have a show of hands, please? Who knows what democracy is? And one guy looked at the other guy, and the other guy looked at the other guy, and they just stood there and shrugged and had no idea what we were talking about. And then one man stepped out from the back of the crowd and pushed his way forward and kind of looked at everyone a little bit shyly. And he said, democracy means that we tell the government what to do, they don't tell us what to do. It's an anecdote where I found there were grounds for despair because most everyone didn't have a clue. And then there was that one guy, that spark of light. So the question is, can democracy take root in the Arab world? Does it depend on development, or does development depend on democracy? Our panel is going to be led by Uthman Olayan, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of Olayan America Corporation. Uthman, welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted this afternoon to lead the discussion. Our topic is a very big and complicated one. Our topic is economic development and democracy in the Arab world. Thankfully, we have three experts to help us navigate through this complicated path. Ambassador Edward Walker, President and CEO of the Middle East Institute in Washington, Dr. Shibli Telhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, and Dr. Isabel Coleman, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and Director of the Women in U.S. Foreign Policy Program. Before we begin, I wish to make a very brief observation to help frame the discussion. Like it or not, the Arab world finds itself once again at the global center stage. There's a lot at stake here. I think we all sense a tremendous global yearning about the region. If we can solve the Middle East, we can solve any problem in the world. The contrasts in the Arab world seem more starkly drawn than in any other part of the world. Take, for instance, the gulf between the haves and the have-nots, the young and the old, the traditional and the modern, the peaceful and the violent, the male and the female. The region has lagged behind much of the rest of the world. Experts both inside and outside talk not only about budget deficit, but they talk about knowledge deficit, technology deficit, empowerment and diplomacy and freedom. However, I believe it would be wrong to conclude that the Arab world is either standing still or moving backward. I think this is an illusion. 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, still nets in 1 step forward. nor should we lose sight of the fact that many areas of the Arab world are vibrant and interesting. While developing nations are getting old and gray, the Arab population is among the world's youngest and fastest growing. This poses an immense challenge, but also a great opportunity. Moreover, some Arab economies are absolutely booming thanks to the oil revenues, but also thanks to the aggressive, open, and liberalizing economic agendas that some of them have pursued. And finally, winds of reform are blowing all the way from Morocco to the Gulf. The question in everybody's mind is, would this be a pleasant breeze, or would it be a violent sandstorm? I will leave that question for our panelists to think about as they give us their thoughts. We will start with Ned Walker, who will give us the view from Washington, followed by Shibli, who will give us the view from the Arab world. And finally, we will turn to Isabel Coleman for the real crux of the issue, the role of women and democracy in development. Each of our panelists will speak for 10 minutes, and then we will invite questions from the floor. I give you first Ambassador Walker.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity to come together on what is a very complex situation and a very complex subject, which cannot be dealt with in 10 minutes. So I will rely on Bethana to tell me when the time is up so we don't use all my time. I think that the first thing to remember is that this is not promotion of democracy and development is not a new thing for the United States. It has been a policy that has lasted through a number of administrations, successfully in some cases, not very successfully in others. What is new about this administration and the approach it's taken is really its emphasis on the Middle East and the promotion of democracy in the Middle East. When I was Assistant Secretary in the previous administration, we had to scrabble to find any money whatsoever to have programs that would support civil society, build up democracy, and so on. Most of the effort was being placed in Africa, in Latin America, and other areas, with some justification because they were riper, if you will, and the problems in the Middle East are so much more complex than in some of these other areas. But what this administration has done is, first of all, is to put a major rhetorical emphasis on democracy promotion and the use of democracy to achieve U.S. objectives in the region and broader. There are a couple of theories that go behind this. I'm not convinced of the theories, but certainly one of them that is often talked about is the fact that democracies don't support terrorism and democracies don't make war on one another. I think if you take the overall record, that's probably demonstrable, but I don't know whether that would be demonstrable in the future. It still remains to be seen. The second theory really has been that we have an objective of supporting democracy because of our own culture, our own beliefs, our belief structure. And I think there's a lot to that we do believe that democracy is an answer for many of the things that create problems in the Middle East, particularly in the area of development and so on. So I think there is justification for taking this view. The question is how you do it. And it seems to me that the administration has outlined two approaches to the development of democracy in the region. The first is imposition of democracy, and that is what we've seen in Iraq. That's what we've seen in Afghanistan. There are certainly some in the administration who are looking ahead and are beginning to say, well, we've done it in Iraq, we've done it in Afghanistan, maybe we ought to think about Iran next, and then where does Syria fit in? There are others that are saying, wait a minute, we haven't finished the job in Iraq or in Afghanistan. Let's digest what we've already got on the table before we go any further. But the debate is out there, and it'll be answered after the elections if the administration is reelected. And the other, if Kerry wins, then he's going to have to deal with some of these problems as well. So it's going to be an issue before us for some time. The other trend line that the administration has put out is fundamentally that we can encourage democracy, and this is the soft side or the soft power approach. Now, encouraging democracy, first of all, is the rhetorical encouragement, the speeches the president gives, and so on. But it's also money and programs that can encourage the development of civil society, the kinds of basic structure that you need in order to have a successful democracy. Now, unfortunately, this part of the equation is really very poorly funded, not very heavily supported. You have the Middle East Partnership Initiative that was announced with a fair amount of fanfare, but it's $129 million. $129 million divided by 22 Arab countries, and I think they throw in a few non-Arab countries as well, doesn't go very far. Particularly if you start comparing it with the about $25 billion we have put into Egypt for economic and democratic development and so on, and look where Egypt is after all these years of support. We cannot say that $129 million is going to do anything. I'm not suggesting for a minute it's not a good idea, because it is, and there are some good programs that are coming out of it, but it's not nearly enough, and it's not going to help a great deal, and it requires one essential agreement to be successful. It has to be done in partnership with the countries involved, and it has to have the leadership of the countries involved, and that remains to be seen whether that can be done. A second problem with the program, which deals with the economy and then deals with democratization and education, the second problem is that they tend to be broad programs covering the whole region. Most countries in that region are very different from one another. They have different problems, and we have to take account of those different problems. We have a massive problem in Iraq. We're devoting $200 billion to it so far, and we're still counting. That is the essence of the democracy program, which isn't terribly successful at this point. I think we have to refine our efforts throughout the rest of the region, put a lot more resources into it, and not think in terms of pressure. It's an excellent time for the United States to take this initiative and to be out in the front, because the countries themselves in the region are feeling their own internal pressure. They don't need us to tell them that they need to have reform or that they need to have distribution of power in the country. They have the pressure from unemployment, 20 to 25%. They've got to deal with that, otherwise they face explosion. They've got the pressure of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism which is taken a radical form, which in leading to terrorism, and which can destabilize governments unless they do something to satisfy the needs of their people. They have dissatisfaction in the region with the status quo. They have the information revolution, which is opening up all of the questions, our own media, their media, so that people can see what's happening in the rest of the world. You can't hide anymore. So I think that what we have now is an incredible opportunity of regimes throughout that part of the world who are ready to reform, who are ready to change, and you're seeing evidence of it. 4 years ago, I would never have believed they'd had an election, a real election in Saudi Arabia. We're about to see that take place. Amazing things have taken place throughout the Gulf and in some of the other countries in the region, North Africa. We can help. We can make an enormous contribution to this, but they have to take the lead. And I would say that it is time for us to sit down with countries involved to come up with a strategic plan or a feasibility study for each of these countries in partnership with them, and find ways that we in the international community can be supportive and can help them do what they want to do. One of the most productive programs that I see in the Partnership Initiative is a program in Jordan for education, special schools to try to develop new courses and new kinds of education in Jordan. This was an initiative from the Jordanian government first, 2 years before it ever came to us and the partnership. It was an initiative that was done with the World Economic Forum as well, and with a number of companies and so on. Then they came and they got some money out of the partnership initiative, but it was not our initiative. And I think that's the key and the important component of any effective approach. We need to put more resources into it. The partnership initiative, which is supposed to be the leading edge of our program, has less people employed than my own organization. Believe me, I don't have very many people employed in my organization. So I hope that the new administration will take seriously its rhetoric on both sides. This is a bilateral, this is not a partisan issue. I think both parties support this, both presidential candidates support it. We have an opportunity. Let's hope we can make use of it.
Thank you. Dr. Shibla.
Thanks very much. I'm honored to be here. I speak as a political scientist, and I certainly don't represent the view from any part of the world, but you will see, if anything, my bias as a political scientist if there's some economists who are here in this place. What I'd like to do is make a few points, each of which would require a lot of elaboration, but I'll put them here for just to make the case, and hopefully we'll follow up on some of them in the discussion. First, I think we have, in our thinking about democracy and political reform in the Middle East specifically, we must decouple that issue from the issue of fighting terrorism. It has to be a different story. Most certainly, the Middle East needs political and economic reforms. It is desperately needed in that part of the world. And it should be an end in itself to pursue that, both by parties in the region and by the international community, but not because of this assumption that we have that somehow that is the way to fight terrorism. I think in the long term it may be. But in the short term, in fact, we have to understand that that is not the way things have fallen in the Middle East. We've had dictatorships where there was very little terrorism. We've had democracies where there was very little terrorism. We had the opposite of both. And in fact, any transitions to democracy, which inevitably take a long time from authoritarianism to democracy, in all cases, that transition is destabilizing. That transition is more difficult. Witness what we see now in Iraq. We don't know what the outcome will be. We all hope that it will be a good outcome. But in the meanwhile, no doubt that there is more terrorism in Iraq. No doubt that there will be more instability in the foreseeable future. And so we have to be willing to pay that price if that is a priority issue. Therefore, I suggest that we decouple the two issues. Second, we can't think of democracy and non-democracy as if they're just a black and white choice. There are grades. There are differences between democracies and differences between countries where democracy doesn't exist in the same way that we know it. There is a big difference between Egypt, which is an authoritarian, non-democratic state, but there is a big difference between what you see in Egypt and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. There is a big difference between Morocco, which is another authoritarian regime, and Saddam's Iraq. And we have to keep in mind that the question is not about how do we get democracy in the same way we want it, but how do we progressively move toward political liberalization, empowerment of the individual. Third, we must differentiate between the goal of attaining international human rights and the goal of changing political systems. Those two are obviously related in some ways. Democracy is about, in a way, a human right, empowerment of the individual. But it is so much more difficult to attain, and we don't know how to do it. I think it is very hard for us to do it, and it's very hard for countries to know how to do it. We political scientists have studied this for a long time. We have no consensus on it, and witness in our own backyard a place like Haiti, which is important to us, in which we put a lot of resources, how difficult it has been to attain. Whereas on human rights, there are some global standards that we must insist on, and they must be applied elsewhere, and they have to be part of our agenda separate from our agenda. It's not that we should give up on democracy. It is, what I'm saying is, we should not tie them together as if you don't get one, you don't have human rights. We must differentiate those areas. Fourth, I think, if you look at the meaning of what we at least intend by democracy, we clearly mean individual rights, the power of the individual empowerment, liberty. And I think when you look at the historical trends, I think it is impossible to divorce that from economic rights and economic reform. In fact, you can make a very strong argument in historical perspective that the emergence of democracy in the West after years of the Dark Ages was, in part at least, a function of the industrialization, which meant the empowerment of individuals. And you see where women increasingly attain more and more rights, even in villages, in traditional places. It comes with the economic empowerment of the women. And clearly, economic reform is an essential component for sustained political reform. You can have episodes of political reform without economic reform. Clearly, they go hand in hand. In order to have good economic reform, you have to have a legal system that would give people in business to have faith in the system to be able to pursue it. But I think it is very important for us to understand that it's a sustained effort that requires a focus in large part on economic reform. Fifth, I think the role of outside powers is often overstated. I think democracies are not imposed from within. Outside powers can help when there is demand for help, when there is a readiness to accept that help. In fact, more often than not, we see outside powers doing more damage than help. Let me give you an example. I think in this particular case, I have no doubt that when our elites, when we say in our American debate that we want democracy, we mean it. But in reality, that is not our national security priority. Our national security priority for now is to fight the war against Al-Qaeda. And if there is a trade-off, as there is often the case, it is almost always the case that we will choose the former over the latter, that we will choose that which assists us in the war on terrorism over that which will help us push for democracy. Witness what we see in Pakistan, which is a very important ally. General Musharraf has been a courageous leader in supporting the war on terrorism. But the bottom line is, we are not going to insist on his empowering a majority which for now is on the other side of the war on terrorism. And as a consequence, what you see is the exact opposite of what we intend. And you can replicate that picture all over the Middle East. In fact, let me give you the numbers. I've done a survey in 6 Arab countries recently. And when you ask them, in Iraq, which we had thought would be a model of inspiration for the region, do you believe that Iraqis are better off today than they were before the war? The vast majority in the Arab world believe Iraqis are worse off. And they're frightened by the Iraqi model, not inspired by it, at least in the short term. But when you ask them about their own countries, do you believe that there is more democracy in the Arab world today than there was before the war? The vast majority say there is less democracy, not more democracy. Now that's astounding, given the fact that we know there wasn't much democracy before the war. The reason for it is very clear. The public in the region had gone against the foreign policies of these governments, particularly in the Iraq war and supporting the Iraq war. And these governments, in choosing to work with the United States of America, had to go against their public, and they became increasingly insecure, and therefore they cracked down in the meanwhile much more than before. And so the outcome was not what we had intended. It was exactly the opposite of what we had intended. Sixth point, on the trade-off that we always have between working with governments and working with the civil society, the people. Clearly, American foreign policy for a long time has been focused on working with governments. That's been the case, in part because we thought that authoritarian regimes can overcome their public opinion. Today, there is obvious need to focus on approaching the public and gaining the public. For one thing, we're trying to empower the public. How could you go for reform when, A, your ally on the war on terrorism is the very agencies that you want to weaken, the security services, the army, the governments, and when public opinion is against you? The very people you want to empower are rooting against you. How could that be possibly successful? Final point. I think that there is no way we can push forward with reform unless it's a partnership. We can't set ourselves against the government and the people, certainly not both, and succeed. You have to find ways to bridge, and that means you have to create mutual incentives. The region has its own incentive to want to liberalize, both economically and politically, and we've got to build on those commonalities to move forward, because it cannot be done by the outside world against the wishes of the locals in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shibli.
Thank you. Well, as Hutham said, I'm going to get to the crux of the matter, which is the role of women and democracy. And Shibli has already touched on the rich debate over economic development first or democracy first, and this is a debate that's gone on for a long time. One thing I think that there is a consensus about is that the participation of women is critical to democracy. Now, there's certainly examples of early democracies where large portions of the population were disenfranchised. Our own history certainly includes that. Great Britain, where you had early democracies where only 5% of the population actually participated in that. But over time, our theories and our thinking on democracy have evolved, thankfully, and now it is generally accepted that women should be part of that. And talking about the debate between democracy first or economic development first, there is thinking that has been triggered mostly by the East Asian tiger experience that led many to believe that really you should have economic development first. But there's new research that's come out that looks at the progress of democracies and economic growth and authoritarian countries. And the democracies win out. And they've actually had stronger economic growth over the past 30 years. And most importantly, stronger indicators on social development, which I think is very important. And one thing that we do know is that women are very, very important for economic development. That is absolutely clear. There's very compelling data on the role that women play in economic development. Arguably, educating girls is one of the most powerful tools for economic development that we know of today. When you educate a girl, you improve not only her own prospects, but those of her family, her community. You reduce incidence of infant mortality, improve child nutrition, and then dramatically accelerate and sustain that momentum over the next generation. It's a very powerful tool for development, as just one example. The good news is that I think in the Middle East today, there is a growing awareness of the importance for women for economic development, for political development, and a growing consensus that they need to be part of that reform process. Both of my panelists have already mentioned the role that women are playing in the reform initiatives across the region. And I think that we have momentum right now with very rapidly rising literacy rates of women across the region and a growing awareness of the importance of women to economic change. I think we have the makings of a sea change on the role of women in the region. I am going to suggest a five-point plan to encourage that sea change. The first is education. While the Middle East has made significant progress in terms of girls' education and closing the gender gaps in literacy, the sad fact is that only 51% of women in the region are literate today, and there's still clearly a lot of room for improvement. And gender gaps exist in several countries that are very large. And although they have been closing, I think they could close much more rapidly. And we've heard already about some innovative programs in Jordan. There are other programs going on in Egypt and all over the region, Morocco, that work and that should be supported much more fully than they are today. And when the United States should be putting their efforts behind it. Now, literacy doesn't lead to democracy. I think the example of Saudi Arabia, which has had 2% literacy just in the beginning of the middle of the 60s, and in one generation has gone to almost full literacy today, about 90% literacy, is an example of a country that you don't have a straight line between rising literacy rates and democracy. but it certainly is an important component that enables women and the broader citizenship to participate more fully in society as it does reform and open up. Education includes also educating men and women about their existing legal and political rights. In many of these countries, they're signatories to international conventions, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, many different international treaties which give their citizens many full rights, and yet very few people in rural areas even know about those rights, understand what they are, and it's important that men and women have a fuller understanding. In terms, the second item would be economic empowerment, giving women more control over economic resources through microfinance, small business, development loans, creating a legal and regulatory environment that is supportive of women in the economic sphere, making sure that women have property rights. The Middle East needs to create 80 million new jobs over the next 10 years. That's a lot of jobs. And people are concerned that increasing women's workforce participation is going to add to that burden. But there's actually interesting data that shows just the opposite. Countries where women are active in the workforce have lower levels of unemployment in the Middle East. And I think it's a sign of a more adaptive, innovative, and open economy where women are working. The fastest growing segment of employment in the United States over the past decade has been women-owned small businesses. And that's a statistic that when I speak in the Middle East, men, their ears always pick up because they understand the connection between women and economic development, and they're interested not in secondary issues of what women wear or how, whether they can drive or not drive, but in how they're able to leverage the investment that they've made in girls' education and how they're able to enable their wives and sisters and daughters to participate fully in the economy. The third item is supporting women leaders. I think this is incredibly important and something the United States can do effectively. Rolling out the red carpet for women leaders when they visit in Washington, it gives them an international platform. It gives them media exposure. It gives them credibility and legitimacy back home. And now that can sometimes work against women also. But I think the idea of providing women with a larger stage and showing how important it is that their work, whether it's in the educational field or in some of the social services or in the political arena, that Western United States, European countries are watching and noticing and supporting that. Giving Shirin Ebadi the Nobel Peace Prize for Iran, I think, was a very symbolic measure. Many people said, well, why did she deserve the Nobel Peace Prize? Well, I think there was an element of political statement there, and the political costs of imprisoning her and of neglecting her agenda in Iran have greatly gone up for the Iranian government. Number 4, supporting local initiatives. I echo strongly what Shibli has said, in that this can't be imposed from outside, and it really must be a locally driven affair. And there are so many very good women leaders, NGOs, different initiatives across the region that are trying to improve the lives of women and girls and are doing very innovative work that should be fully supported by the West. Just as an example, women are running for office all around the Middle East. In Saudi Arabia, as the upcoming election has been noted, there's a woman running for a municipal position, and these people across the region should be supported to the extent that they can. Now, being embraced by the United States might be the last thing that some of these candidates want, but there are other ways to do it. And the National Democratic Institute, NED, they've been very good at providing women with training through local NGOs that are not seen as being embraced by the United States, but that give them very effective and important training. And the fifth thing is working with religious leaders and scholars. I think it's incredibly important to work with the institutionalized power base. And Afghanistan has had some interesting programs over the last year that I'll mention. President Karzai has been very effective at getting the mullahs to get the women to vote, to register to vote. Now, you can be cynical and say this is a get out the vote campaign on his part, but it has had a tremendous impact on educating tribal leaders and people in positions of authority about the importance of allowing women to participate in an important public event. For many people, for many women, it's their first experience outside their home. But 40% or more now of those who are registered to vote in Afghanistan are women. It's quite a profound change. And the role of the mullah has been incredibly important in this process. The theocracy in Iran was very critical in introducing birth control there, and in just a short amount of time, through Friday prayers, managed to lower the birth rate in Iran from one of the highest in the world to one of the lowest in the world today. And again, it's the use of religious leaders to get behind that. Supporting religious scholars, some who are in the West because they've had to flee their countries because of persecution, but who are writing about Islam in a different way and reevaluating the role of women in Islam. And I think supporting those who are no longer alive also. There are many religious scholars from over the centuries, in particular the 19th century, who have reevaluated the role of women in Islam. And these are publications that should be reprinted, circulated, and supported. And these are not expensive things to do. They, I think, fit into some of these lower-cost initiatives that we're thinking about, but could have a powerful impact for change over time.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I now will open the floor. I will now open the floor for questions. Please use the microphone, state your name, and make your question short and to the point. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I'll be as brief as I can, although being a decade diplomat, that comes hard to me. Having been a development economist for a long time, and now I am an extinguished development economist, I have a two-part question. Number one, is it that economic development per se leads to democracy, or is it the form and shape it takes and the growth model that is adopted, and in particular, the equitable distribution of rewards of economic development in the various elements of society which lead to democracy? The second part of the question is, what has been in my mind as I listen to news here and elsewhere in the world, is democracy intrinsically alien to Arab culture in particular, and Islamic culture in general? I don't subscribe to it, but I'm posing it as a question. Or is it a result of historical, economic, and other factors, such as colonization, autocracies which replace them, and particularly the disenfranchisement and alienation of the people from their government? Thank you.
Why don't we start with Shibli?
First, I think on the literature, at least in our field, pertaining to relations between economic development and political liberalization, there really is no consensus on that issue. But I could tell you at least the theory why economic development will lead to demand for political participation. It's based on at least the assumption that economic development is in part a market-driven economic development, where it does lead to the individual economic empowerment. That is, rather than to a centralized model of development. And if you look at what happened in South Korea or what even is happening in China, clearly you can say that China is not democratic. That's obvious. If you look at China and you say, is China today more politically liberal than it was 20 years ago, I think the answer is quite obvious. It's certainly incrementally better than it was 20 years ago in terms of political rights. The theory here is that the change, the economic change, the emergent, more powerful economic individuals and entities demand more and more clout in the political process, and as a consequence, you have a decreased centralization of political authority. That is the view of that relationship. As for the Arab world, I think we have to keep a couple of things in mind. One is that, yes, it's pretty bad out there, but, you know, in the third world in general, the countries that became independent largely after World War II, the countries that have not had the development of the West, we've had problems. The success stories are actually few and far in between. And in some of the Arab countries, for episodes of time, it looked like they were moving in the right direction. I think what is remarkably absent in the Arab world, and I think that's the issue that has to be more considered, and what's the historical context of it, particularly in the 20th century, is the absence of what I call accountability. Forget democracy for a minute, but the absence of accountability. And here I think you can, for example, look at places like a democracy, or a place like an authoritarian government like the one in Argentina when the generals ruled in Argentina. The generals take the country to a war that was popular in the Falkland Islands. And the people back it up. It's a nationalistic issue. When Argentina lost the war, they blame Britain. They don't blame their own country or their own government. But they still blamed the leaders for making the mistake of going on an adventure that was a losing war. That happens with democracies. In Israel, people blame the Palestinians for the failure of the negotiations, not their own Prime Minister Barak, but they dumped him anyway, because you hold people accountable even if you blame the other more. I think what you see in the Arab world is, I think, an absence of accountability, where you lose wars, you win wars. Actually, you hardly win wars. I don't know a war that was won. But you certainly, you can lose wars, you can have an economic disaster, you can have trouble, and no one seems to be paying a price. That, I think, is unique, and in part it might be explained by historical experience of the Arab world in the 20th century, where the blame is focused on the outside because of the history of imperialism, and I think the Arab-Israeli issue is a factor. But there are unique circumstances that go beyond culture. I'm not opposed to the thought of invoking culture, but I don't see anything peculiar about the culture that would disallow that.
Second question. Yes.
Yes, a fascinating discussion of democracy and development and women's rights. The only thing that would be better if it could actually occur in an Arab nation. But of course, presumably the Arab governments and the Arab media won't allow this kind of roundtable discussion or debate. Do you foresee a time when issues about individual people can actually occur in these countries?
I would say it's happening today. You have a national dialogue going on in Saudi Arabia today, which most people don't know about, but which is incredible in terms of what people are talking about. 2 years ago, I visited Saudi Arabia. You sit around the table with people, and they sort of talk about the Palestinian issue, or they talk about the Iraq situation, or so on. Today, you go and sit around the table, and they talk about reform and change in Saudi Arabia. They talk about religion. They talk about education. That national dialogue includes women. It includes the Shiites. It includes all of the sects that are prevalent in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is just the tip of the iceberg. This national debate is in effect going on in every single country in that part of the world. It's incredible what's happening. And that's why I'm encouraged by... It's occurring in Saudi, it's occurring in public, in an organized national dialogue. It's a series of seminars in which people are brought in and they discuss these issues very candidly, very openly. And it is part of the Crown Prince's effort to develop a national consensus behind reform, because without that, he can't move forward. So it's a very planned kind of opportunity to build a strategic plan and a vision for Saudi Arabia in the future and get the people's input into it.
Well, can I add to this just a little bit? Because, I'm sorry, go ahead. You haven't first spoken.
I was just going to add that in April, at the invitation of the Emir of Qatar, I gave a talk at a conference that he hosted in Doha, and the title of it was democracy and economic development. There were 300 leaders from across the Arab world who were there, many from Saudi Arabia, many from Egypt, from all over the Gulf, from far away as Morocco, and the entire area was represented. Political leaders, a lot of business leaders, media people were there. It got a lot of press, and it's the 3rd or 4th annual conference that the Emir has held. And that's just one example, but there are many conferences like that I'm invited to. I'm sure Shibli is also, and all of us have participated. And I think it is astounding every year to see how the debate and the dialogue has shifted and changed and become much more open.
Well, let me just say, there's certainly more dialogue than they used to have before. It's still a limited dialogue. Don't get the impression, I think, that we've got a dialogue where people are directly challenging the governments. There's still a limited dialogue with very few exceptions. It's better than it was, but it's limited. But there is an area where there's a lot of dialogue on this level and more, and that is the media. Because of that revolution in the satellite media, the one that we're now criticizing because we're saying, they're maybe being anti-American. That has revolutionized the debate. Most people don't get their notion of what's happening from these fora that few people go to, whether they're in Riyadh or in Doha, but from television. And television has become such an arena where there is more debate, including on women. I watched an extraordinary show on Al Jazeera television by women, feminists, Arab feminists, talking about the lack of empowerment in society in the most sophisticated way that I, in fact, would crave to have in our own institutions. So you find that the new media, which is really having more impact on public perception, on the debate, which is now not directly sort of manipulated or controlled by governments, although they have a hand in it, has opened up the arena much more than in the past.
Al Jazeera has a show called For Women Only. It's an hour-long program, and maybe that's what you saw, but it's a regular show that deals with very difficult and profound women's issues across the region now.
Last spring, when we were all looking at the reform agenda and the administration was going to talk to the EU and so on, we were going to come up with our own reform agenda for the Arab world. The Arab NGOs got together and they had a conference in Alexandria. They came up with an agenda which did criticize their governments, which was more forthright and far-reaching than the State Department had put together as a potential agenda. It was an extraordinary document. I hope it's implemented.
Next question, gentlemen.
Well, it's very pleasant to know that some kind of national dialogue takes place in Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, the Saudi organization with very close ties to the royal family and Saudi government continue to finance terrorist groups around the world and continue this message of hatred toward not only non-Muslims but toward all people which are non-Wahhabis. Can United States try to influence its key ally and force them to change this practice? Thank you.
The foreign minister of Russia just answered that question.
Yes,
and I can only repeat what he said. I mean, he said that there is an effort that is a united effort with the United States and that the Saudis are now dealing directly with Russia on this issue. Late, agreed, but they're dealing with it now. And he wouldn't go into the details, but I have no way to know what those details were.
Yes, but foreign minister was talking in his official capacity, and he wasn't able to disclose anything. So he wasn't frank, because he is minister. But you're not minister, and I would like to have a frank answer.
Now, look, there is no question that the Chechnya situation is quite a different proposition and has had a long history now of support from Saudi Arabia for the Chechen rebels or whatever, however you want to define them. I think the foreign minister made a very important point, though, and one that we all have to be aware of. It doesn't matter why you're doing it. If you're engaged in terrorism, you're engaged in terrorism. We have to be against you no matter what your mission is or your cause. And I think that the world in general, certainly we understand that here in the United States. I think that there is some of the parts of the world have been slow to come to it. I think it certainly is a lot clearer in Saudi Arabia today since their problem with terrorism erupted in March of 2003. I would expect the cooperation to improve. It's not perfect by a long means. There's a lot of work to still be done, and I think your point is well taken. The United States ought to be encouraging that kind of cooperation.
Well, let me, if I may, just introduce a little differentiation into this discourse, because I think it's we're saying, you know, we're not making a clear differentiation between support for a cause and support for terrorists who may use terrorist means for a cause. I think there is no question that in Arab and Muslim countries there is sympathy with the Chechens. With the Chechens as a national movement, that's the way they define it, that's the way they see it. They have empathy for the Chechens. That's legitimate. That's the right. You know, they may see it, you may see the issue differently, as they would with the Palestinians. The issue that we should oppose is when any group would use terrorist means for political ends, and when a government deliberately supports that means. Now, to make that accusation, one would have to have evidence, because in the Saudi case, one can say there were a lot of indiscretions in the process of not differentiating, perhaps at some levels. But clearly, in the case of al-Qaeda specifically, al-Qaeda was first and foremost targeting the Saudi government before it even targeted the American government. So it's hard to imagine that that would have been one of their aims, to sort of empower al-Qaeda as an organization that would come back to haunt them at home.
But
Thank you. Can we have the next question, please? Thank you.
Hi, I have a question about, you had mentioned that development cannot occur from external sources. It has to happen from within the region. And I have a question about Arab leadership. And it seems when it comes to making collective decisions and collective initiatives, they have a bit of difficulty and they seem quite fragmented. How important is it for Arab leadership to unite in order to develop the Middle East region?
Sure.
Well, I think that, as somebody mentioned, the Arab leaders, NGO leaders, came together and made the Alexandria Statement. There have been numerous statements made by Arab leaders. The Tunis Declaration, there's been a lot of them recently. The Arab League has come together and made pronouncements on reform. But they do tend to be pretty empty at the end of the day, and they're watered down, and a lot of times I think they're for international consumption and not domestic consumption. Every country in the Arab world is very different, and I think each country needs its own reform plan and its own reform agenda. And they're starting from such different points that I think it's very important to remember that and keep that in mind. You've got some countries that are incredibly poor countries with very low levels of education, some much wealthier countries, much higher levels of education, and they've got different needs and different challenges. I mean, I mentioned the conference in Doha. Well, it's relatively easy for the emir to hold a conference. He's got 200,000 rich and happy citizens. It's much more difficult in Saudi Arabia, where you've got 25 million people who are not so happy and feel that they're much less rich today than they were just a generation ago. And it's very different circumstances, very different and challenges. And while it's important, I think, for Arab leaders to unite on certain topics, terrorism is one of them. I would love to see them come together and make a stronger stand on that. Sudan, I think there's a lot of opportunity for Arab leaders to come together and make united comments on issues that I think that they could develop a consensus on. But when it comes to reform, I think the challenges are very different for each of them, and to try to sign up for some reform agenda is probably not realistic.
I think it's also important, though, that the Arab leadership in a country get behind reform. I'm not a person who believes that you can really do bottom-up reform, simply because it can only take you so far if the leadership is against it. When I went into Egypt as an ambassador, we had a very productive program for a long period of time under the Gore Mubarak initiative, which led to some serious reform. And I went back there this year, and the same things we were talking about in 1996 were still on the agenda. They hadn't been done. Nothing had been done with it, partly because we didn't push anymore, partly because there was no leadership. So it needs to have both. It needs to have bottom-up, and it needs to have support from the top. And that's where we, as a government, come in, I think, to encourage that reform agenda among the leadership in the region. Most of them are already sympathetic, and most of them do recognize if they don't do something, they won't be leaders very much longer.
We'll have one more question for this afternoon.
Amartya Sen wrote a compelling argument about property rights and their key, the foundation to economic development. Do you feel do you agree with that principle of property rights being fundamental to economic development? And do you feel that is either underway in the Middle East and the Arab countries?
What rights? I didn't hear.
Property rights.
Economic development and property.
Property rights.
Property rights.
I talked about the need for property rights for women, and I think I'm a big adherent and proponent of Amartya Sen's work. I think he has a number of striking thoughts on these subjects, and there is some very interesting research that Amartya Sen and Hernando de Soto and others have done on the importance of property rights and how that gives you a stake in the economic system. It basically provides collateral which you can build on and have your own economic growth from that foundation. And poor people, as De Soto has shown, in Latin America have benefited greatly from property.
A lot to be explored, but as many economists would point out, this is not exactly, a winning thesis today about how to proceed with development. It's an important one. But in the end, I think it's about economic empowerment, one way or the other. In this case, it's about the generation of capital that is idle. I happen to think that political demand, that might be more linked to growth and development than to the political empowerment. I think the demand for political empowerment in the end comes from economic empowerment that an individual has in society that want to translate and cash in as political empowerment. And so you have to find a way, whatever way you explore, you have to find a way to do that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Shipley. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Walker.